All right, so it is the top of the hour. We have quite a few people on now, so I think we can go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for joining our webinar today, Rethinking Secure Access. We have two great speakers joining us, and today our topic of discussion is transitioning from VPN to ZTNA. With new cyber threats and work from home policies, managing corporate networks is definitely changing. The day of logging in with your VPN and allowing the firewall to just let everyone come in when they can and go around your network is definitely changing. ZTNA is all the rage because it doesn't allow people within the network to move around with full access. So we're going to talk about some of that today. I'm going to introduce our two speakers. Jay, can you go to the next slide? So Justin is Comport Security Field CTO. He works with customers to create strategies within the security space and the networking space. He is very familiar with top network providers, and he works to map your acceptable levels of risk with your strategy. Jay Tilson is the field CTO and technologist coming from HPE with 25 years of experience implementing global strategic programs. He has a focus on digital transformation, so he's perfect to discuss how the world of networking is changing. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Justin to discuss our agenda, introduce Comport, and discuss the topic with Jay. Justin?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Laura. So, yeah, as Laura mentioned, my name is Justin Youngblood. A little bit about Comport as part of the introduction. So Comport's been around for over 40 years. We were really born in the storage space, aligning with DAC and a few other things. So our strategic alignment with HPE has been super strong. And as we see HPE make acquisitions with companies like Aruba and companies like Access and companies like Juniper soon become, you kind of seen Comport doing the exact same things, right? Our network strategy, our security strategy, when we've started investing into resources, into our professional services teams, are really in line with HPE in a lot of ways. So it's kind of fun to watch both companies grow up at somewhat the same pace, or at least the same ratio. So we're going to talk today about the security landscape all around ZTNA, SASE, SSE, right? Like those are kind of the three buzzwords that we're hearing in the industry today. And what I really want to kind of help everyone on the call with today is help kind of understand what those marketing words really mean, because they can all mean the same thing to some people and they can mean very different things to others. And those three words are used very, very interchangeably today. And they do have some differentiators there and some build up to another. So we're going to talk about that and really talk about kind of the traditional VPN model and what options are out there today and what kind of performance gains you'll see, what kind of security you'll see, improvements on efficiency for all your employees. This is a live webinar, so if you have questions throughout the webinar, go into the chat, add the question in there, and I'll interrupt Jay and ask that question for you. So definitely ask away with anything you have and play Stump the Chump with Jay today. With that, I'll let Jay kind of introduce himself a little bit, and we'll get right into it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Okay, so my name is Jay Tilson. I'm the field CTO and distinguished technologist for the security portfolio in HPE Aruba. I've been with the company now about 18 months, and I was part of the acquisition of Access Security. My early life, when I came out of university, my first ever job was working for a company called ID Software. For anybody that remembers ID Software, my mum said I spent the first 2 years of my career playing games. I would say I was supporting games rather than playing games. I then transitioned over to work for a large Japanese manufacturing company where I spent around 12 years looking after everything on the network before cyber became a thing. I then transitioned from that to work and follow a passion of mine and work in Formula One for 3 seasons, working for Mercedes. And then I went back to working in a large UK-based manufacturing company. But we had sites all over the globe, 30 plus sites. So I'm very familiar with deploying things like MPLS and SD-WAN and looking after everything on the network, even before we were considering things like zero trust. I then decided that the way in which the world was going was different in the way we should be treating it. I was really concerned about ransomware and insider threat and people being able to go all over my network. So I started to go down the route of things like microsegmentation and NAC, and a new technology was being talked about called ZTNA. I went on a journey with an initial ZTNA vendor before realizing that there were some use cases they couldn't quite fulfill for me, which is how I found Access, which is why I'm here talking to you today. So really in my slides, I hope to shed some light on the terms SASE and SSE and SD-WAN, and even talk a little bit around universal ZTNA. So let's just get going, right? So I guess we're all here because the world's changed. As I've said, I've been in the industry for 25 plus years, really before LANs even came around. I remember my first ever job, we were hardwiring computers into the back of the ERP system. The LAN came along, we then started to share things on the network. Primarily it was files on a desktop machine under the finance person's desk. Then we started to consider wider networks, wide area networks. We could start to consider having computer rooms and computer centers. Then the cloud came along. We were a little bit reluctant to move to the cloud, but adoption began to grow over time. Then the pandemic came along and really pushed the cloud even further. We start to use things like SaaS and PaaS and IaaS. Then things like pandemic really created that massive shift in where our users were. Our devices are everywhere. And then you bring into the mix IoT and OT. So we have a completely different world that we live in today than we've been living in over the last 25 years. And really, this is what brought along this architecture that we refer to as SASE. So originally designed in 2019, SASE is made up of networking services that you see on the left-hand side, those kind of SD-WAN, WAN optimization, etc. And on the right-hand side in 2019, it was just a list of security services. Gartner then redefined that in 2021 and called it SSE. It's still a bunch of security services. Some of them are relatively old, like SWIG and CASB, but the ZTNA element's relatively new. So really, for me, SASE is bringing together networking and security. It's not treating them independently. It's consolidation, simplification. Gartner have started to talk wider than this now, because when you look at this architecture, it doesn't include anything to do with on-prem. And that made sense. 2021, most people were outside of our networks. They were working at home or in a coffee shop, wherever they might be. We were in a pandemic. People weren't in the office. And therefore, it's missing from this architecture. So this concept of universal ZTNA, which Gartner have now coined, is wider than this, SASE architecture. And it starts to bring on board those NACs, those microsegmentations elements into this single architecture. And really, the reason for that is no matter where our users are, no matter what device they're using, whether that's a BYOD, whether they're a third party or contractor, whether it's a corporate device, and no matter where they are, we need that visibility. One of the things that we gained when people kind of work remotely and use this concept of ZTNA is visibility into what they're doing remotely. But we have a bunch of different tools, okay? And we're very much living in a hybrid world. So we are living in a world where most of our users are remote. There is a push across the world, and I'm seeing this, that companies want people to be on-prem a bit more than they were. In some cases, companies are mandating 5 days a week back in the office. But primarily, we're still seeing some form of hybrid work. So there's still that reliance on VPN. So when we look at the way we can architect our networks today, we really, in my mind, have these three options. And I used to tell this story as a bit of a transition from hub and spoke to virtualized firewalls to SSE. But actually, I see 85% of people are in the hub and spoke model. There's about 10 or 15% in this virtualized firewall model that were like early adopters of it. But now people are going straight towards SSE. But when we look at these designs, specifically the hub and spoke design, it hasn't changed for 25, 30 years. It's still designed in the way that we used to when everything was on-prem. It's still designed in the way where our users were inside our offices, they were on our network, their devices were there, and our data was there. And we had these firewalls around the outside protecting anybody from getting in. But unfortunately, as I've said, we don't live in this world anymore. But also, virtualizing it doesn't fix the problem. You're just virtualizing the same problem. Yes, you may be moving those firewalls a little bit further out, but they're still firewalls. They still come with the same attack surface and the same threat. And maybe maybe this is really around people wanting to protect their revenues and profits for hardware, okay? But really, the new world that I see is SSE. So go
If you
on.
go back to that slide once. So I kind of want to hit one thing there. So I see a lot of organizations where they do exactly what you talked about, but let's swap out the word data center with Azure, AWS. We'll see organizations be like, yeah, we changed our VPN from going from our data center to our predominant cloud hosting. So let's say we're using AWS all the time. We spun up some virtual Meraki, virtual Fortinet, virtual whatever firewall product you're using today, and we just put it in the cloud, and now we're having everyone VPN into there. So now when they have an on-prem solution at the data center, they have to go to the cloud, then go back on-prem. They have to go from one cloud to another. All that traffic still gets anchored to a single space, a single tenant.
Yep.
So you're still taking that 30-year-old design and just putting it inside the cloud, right? Nothing's changed from an efficiency standpoint there. So
yeah, and I mean really that the power of SSE, which the next slide talks about, is the consolidation. And I'll talk a little bit more about the elements of SSE, but it really is about consolidation. So SSE really is about consolidation of security elements. The wider SASE portfolio is consolidating your networking elements with security, and then that universal ZTNA is then consolidating that with your on-prem NAC or segmentation. And really that's to give visibility and control across your whole environment. I want to give a bit of an example, and I use this example quite often. My girlfriend works for a large financial institute in the UK, and she works from home 3 days a week. She's using what I would refer to as a legacy VPN tool. Okay, so she wakes up in the morning, she'll turn on her laptop, open her VPN, she'll MFA, but then she'll traverse all the way over the internet into a firewall or VPN concentrator. She'll then go through all of these different pieces of hardware and software that are on-prem that we'll all be familiar with to jump onto a VDI box, to go back out and spend their whole life in Salesforce. Okay, so you're utilizing the bandwidth twice, you're sending it through all of these on-prem things, and you're working in the cloud right next to where she's sat anyway. And another example I like to give is during the pandemic, she had to share her credentials with a colleague. They didn't have enough VPN licenses, so she was told she was allowed to work until 12:30, and then she would have to disconnect her VPN and let her colleague connect so that her colleague could work. Unfortunately, she spends most of her life responding quite quickly to reports that she needs to get out within 24 hours or 48 hours. But she couldn't do any work for half the day, okay, even though her job is solely in Salesforce. But because she couldn't VPN in, she couldn't work, which for me makes no sense. So when we consider those things around VPN, it really highlights the main issues that I see with VPN, which is really what's pushing this shift towards ZTNA. ZTNA is really a new way of doing remote access. But we've got not only the risks of VPN, so we will see in the press all the time that some of those VPN concentrators and some of those firewalls, those vendors have been compromised. There's major CVEs. You constantly need to firmware and patch them and keep them up to date. And therefore, people are breaking in that front door. They're coming in through an unpatched system. I happened to be in Denmark recently in an event. Somebody did a scan of Copenhagen and said, look, here's a list of all the firewalls and VPN concentrators that are wide open that I can see from the venue. That's scary in itself. And then we know with VPNs, they put users on the network and they can go everywhere. That was mentioned in the introduction. So those are the security risks. Obviously, I've just spoken about the poor user experience. We're backhauling. We're forcing people to go back on-prem to access cloud services. And another example I've got is in my previous company, we were a heavy user of video conferencing. However, because we were backhauling our traffic, the video conferencing tool wouldn't work if you were connected on VPN. Okay, so that brings up a quite a significant scenario where if you, for instance, are connected on your VPN, you want to share some documents with somebody on a video conference, you got really, really poor user experience. So what used to happen was our users would connect their VPN, they would break our corporate policy, and they would download files onto their personal devices that they weren't allowed to do. They would then connect into the video, disconnect the VPN, connect into video, present those documents, make changes to them, share them with colleagues, share them with their boss, whatever it might be, disconnect from the video conference, and then what they were supposed to do was reconnect the VPN and upload them. Most of the time they didn't do that. They got up from their desk and went and got a cup of coffee. So we ended up with files everywhere because of poor user experience of VPN. And then you've got complexities of VPN. I came from a company that was highly acquisitional. I was managing multiple VPNs at any one time. We would acquire a company. They may have the same kind of concentrator as us, but a slightly different version or a completely different firewall vendor. And I would have to manage all those VPNs, as well as trying to explain to users which VPN you need to use to get to which file. Like, you need to use this one to get over here, and then disconnect that one and connect to this one to get over here to get this stuff, or blah, blah, blah. And it was always really complicated. So this is really what's driving that change, okay? So we are seeing people adopt SASE. We are seeing it as something that is beginning to gain traction. We are seeing that people at least understand what the term is, and they're beginning to understand what the business value is. But what is really pushing that is the SSE element, the security element. And I think that makes sense because of the things I've said, because we live in a world where there's ransomware and insider threat. There's a lot of pressure on security. And what I'm also seeing is security teams have a little bit more budget today because of those risks. But what is really driving that SSE adoption is ZTNA. So as I've mentioned, SSE includes things like Secure Web Gateway, Cloud Access Security Broker, Digital Experience Monitoring, Firewall as a Service, those kind of elements. The real new one is the ZTNA, that Zero Trust Network Access. And this is what is driving this kind of a SASE adoption, okay? I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Justin, before I talk a little bit about the vendors.
No, I think you're doing great right now. Keep going.
Perfect. So I think one of the key things to remember is SSE is relatively new. I mean, we are talking 2021. The other elements of this kind of these pillars that you can see on the screen, they're not particularly new, the bulk of them. So Secure Web Gateway has really been around since the internet. Many of you will already have a Secure Web Gateway. It's grown over time. I'm not going to lie to say it's really changed from like core categorization to being able to do threat analysis and be able to do sandboxing, but it's a platform that's been around for a while. Cloud Access Security Broker has been around really since the cloud came around, and it's about control and visibility into what your users are doing in regards to cloud services, like Shadow IT, have they signed up to things, or being able to stop them maybe uploading files to an unknown Dropbox, for instance, and making sure they only use, say, SharePoint or OneDrive. It's those kind of things. But again, CASB's been around a while. Then you've got the ZTNA element, that Zero Trust Network Access. This is the new part. This is the VPN replacement. I think what is really different in today's world is the unification of these platforms together into a single user interface. I think it's worthwhile at this point noting that there are many, many vendors out there that would call themselves SSE. You have some of the firewall vendors that exist out there that are trying to say they're SSE, but we've obviously mentioned a lot of the cases they're not truly SSE. So if you're looking at a vendor, really kind of investigate, are they a firewall vendor? Are they truly doing SSE? And then some of the other vendors in the space, I call them like the version 1 vendors, started maybe with a Secure Web Gateway and then they've added on ZTNA, but it may be in a different user interface, or they've acquired a company. Or you've got people that started in the CASB area and then they've kind of branched out in Secure Web Gateway into ZTNA. But again, there'll be different platforms, different UIs. What we did at HPE, or when we were Access before we were acquired, was we focused on third-party and contractor access. The company was born to resolve that problem where you cannot put an agent on the machine. So that's where we were born. We give access to SSH, Git, RDP, VNC without an agent. For those hard to manage third-party and contractors, for that BYOD. And then on top of that, but on the same code base, within the same single user interface, we built all of the other elements as features. And then the digital experience part is the visibility that wraps around the whole environment. So you can see within single lines of policy, you can configure what people are accessing. Okay. And I'll show that in a bit. In fact, it's this slide. So we don't really mind if you've got a corporate employee, a branch user, a third party, a contractor, whether they're coming in from a corporate device or they're coming in via their own device. Everything agent or agentlessly goes to our central platform called Atmos, and then access is granted. Once posture checks is confirmed and MFA is confirmed, access is then granted into everything you see on the right. That can be into internet, that can be into cloud services, that can be into your public or private data center, that can be on-prem. And you get visibility, that experience wrapper that goes around it and really gives you proactive and reactive visibility into what is happening. We're starting to build AI into the product so that we can start to see user analytics. We can start to see if, for instance, let's take me. Every day I only ever really use video conferencing or Teams or email. If suddenly I log in and I try and upload 2 terabytes of data to a cloud, that's outside the norm. That should be flagged, either flagged and blocked straight away or should be flagged. If somebody only ever goes to a specific office every Wednesday and they never ever go to an office any other time, we can see, okay, why are they logging in from a different country, from a different device? Maybe that's a problem. Block that access. So being able to build that architecture around that is pretty key. Okay. I think one of our core differentiators on top of the kind of single user interface and the third party access is architecture. I think architecture is really critical in the world we live in today. So if you look at the other SSE vendors in the space, they will have their own hardware in data centers that they have to negotiate for, and they'll need to build that hardware in a central location and ship it and put it in place. And there's lead times for that and supply chain issues, et cetera, et cetera. We built all of our infrastructure in the cloud. So we have points of presence and they sit on top of any of the global hypervisors, whether that's Google, Azure, AWS, Alibaba, and they're containerized and we build them really, really quickly. So that means we don't need to worry. If we need a new point of presence somewhere in the world, we don't need to worry about negotiating a new data center contract, ordering hardware, supply chain issues, any of those things. We simply just build a point of presence. A good example is, in fact, I'll give you 2 examples. When I first joined the company, they told me about this, and I have to admit, I didn't necessarily believe them. So when I went on holiday to Italy in the summer, they built a point of presence in Italy when I went so that I could work, so they could get more working hours out of me. And when I came back, we removed the point of presence. Another example is we were working with a South African bank. We didn't have any customers in South Africa at that point, so we didn't bother putting a point of presence there because we don't need to build infrastructure. We did a POC with them, and on a Monday, and the latency was 150 milliseconds because their closest point of presence was in London. Obviously, they found that a little bit disappointing. So overnight, we built a point of presence in South Africa. They came in the next day, and it was less than 5 milliseconds. So they're obviously a customer now. So I'm not going to guarantee that everywhere in the world can have a point of presence built on the cloud because not every country has cloud vendors. But we can also build those on hardware if we need to. And we can also build them what we call local edge. So we can actually take elements of our point of presence and put it on-prem in a site. And what that means is you can continue to use your ZTNA agent when you come on-prem. And rather than the data have to go out to the cloud and back in, if you're accessing something within a physical data center in the office, you just go direct LAN speed access. So what that means is for things like data sovereignty and regulations, we can keep the data either within the site or we can actually keep it within the points of presence. We have some customers that are, let's say, in retail and they don't want to use AWS because they're a competitor. We can avoid AWS POPs. Okay, or they maybe don't want to sign up and use Azure, so we can avoid Azure POPs. So we can pretty much do all of those things and keep data within region. Okay. One of the other
I think that is a pretty. I'll jump in there. I think that is a pretty unique thing to what Access Aruba has put together. A lot of other vendors I've spoke to, sometimes it's a problem and sometimes it isn't, but they only work with AWS, they only work with Azure. There's other products out there where if you're an Azure customer, the SSE platform only uses AWS. All the traffic has to go to AWS, then in Azure, right? There's added latency there that's not needed if an architecture was universal and can ride on whatever carrier provides the lowest latency possible, which this slide here is kind of telling. So I'll let you kind of grab onto that there, Jay. But I think that's super huge where you're very opportunistic on performance.
Yeah, I think it's also worth pointing out that many of the other vendors have different points of presence for different services. As I mentioned, because they have really different platforms and different login credentials, etc., for say their ZTNA versus their secure web gateway, they tend to talk about how many POPs they've got. They'll say we've got 350 POPs, but what they don't say is 100 of them are for ZTNA, 100 of them for a secure web gateway. Maybe they've got 100 for digital experience monitoring. So you'll get a different user experience, because if you're accessing your secure web gateway, you may go a different way, and the POP might not be in country. They may say they've got a POP in country, but they may not. It may not be a secure web gateway POP, or it may not be a ZTNA POP. We decided very early doors to have every one of our POPs do every one of our features. So whether the POP's built on AWS, whether it's built on Azure or GCP, wherever it's built, it does everything. It does ZTNA, it does SWG, it does CASB, and it also does all of the reporting functionality as well. And we also use the, and this slide's quite difficult to show. I've tried drawing it many times, but imagine it's showing one session. So let's say I'm based in the UK like I am, and I'm accessing something in the US. I may well join onto the backbone of the AWS network using their accelerated network, using the multicast address. I jump on the edge of their network. I go to a POP in AWS, and then I then traverse over the AWS Global Accelerated Network to a POP in the US and onto a site through a connector, say in San Diego. But I may well go a completely different route for another session. So let's say I'm also sat here and I'm accessing something in our data center in Germany. I may jump on with this session onto the Azure backbone, traverse over the accelerated network of Azure, and go into a data center in Germany. Or it may well be that I'm accessing a website like Salesforce that is primarily hosted, let's say, in New York. I may jump onto the backbone of the AWS network and access directly at the doorway of Salesforce. Okay, so we've actually had customers tell us that we speed up internet because it's a lot less hops. We use these accelerated networks. It's either based on end-to-end latency, so the user will always get the best latency for end-to-end, or it's based on jitter, depending on what the application requires. And if anything changes during the session, like for instance, for me, when the West Coast of America wakes up around now, things slow down in the US. You've suddenly got all these people coming online. The internet tends to change. We will automatically adjust per session the fastest possible route. So the users will always get the best user experience. They don't know this. They don't know this is going on in the background. The client does it. The client connects to multiple POPs at any one time. At the other end, the connectors connect to multiple POPs at any one time. If anything changes in between, it just automatically adjusts without any issues. So you're always going to get the best possible user experience. The benefits for us as well, being in the cloud, is if you have a GCP outage or an AWS outage or whatever it may be, we just use the other POPs we have. Okay. I mean, there'll be a much bigger problem, I think, in the world if AWS went down. But you can understand what I mean. We've got that resilience, we've got that redundancy, and we've got that smart routing built into the platform. So really, I think the next slide kind of talks through really what are our core differences. And this is a slide I put together recently. If you look at the things that are both green, that to me is the fundamental things that any kind of SSE platform should have in play. We would very much class ourselves as a fast follower. So we view the ZTNA or SSE vendor, the 1.0 vendors, as kind of the category creators. They designed their environment 15 years ago, 10 years ago in a very different world. We were not talking about zero trust in the same way. People didn't trust cloud in the same way. So they were able to architect really with what they had. They had to use physical data centers. They had to rely on certain technologies. We've basically done what they do and do it as well as they do, but we've managed to fill the gaps with new architecture. And also we understand that the world's different now. Since the pandemic, where, like I said, we're in a much more hybrid world. We live in this different world. So we're able to resolve and give answers to questions that people are asking today. So as I said, we've got agentless access. So for third parties and contractors, anyone that you are not comfortable putting an agent on, whether that's someone getting into a black box on your network, whether that's someone getting into machinery to support, whether that's someone logging in to do month end and they're a contractor. A perfect example is Procter & Gamble are one of our largest customers. They have 50,000 contractors working for them. Procter & Gamble were sending out laptops to those contractors because they needed them to use corporate devices so they could put an agent on. They didn't want to put an agent on a non-corporate device. It was costing them between $10 million and $20 million every year to send those machines. They don't need to do that anymore. We give those same contractors agentless access. And it's zero trust. It only gives them access to the specific application or service they need. It does not connect them to the whole network like a VPN does. So there's a good example there. We also do inspection of both private and public traffic. That wasn't something that was architected for 5 years ago, 10 years ago. When CISOs were asked 5 years ago, do you want to be able to scan your private traffic as well? Most CISOs were like, we don't really care. It's within a VPN tunnel. It's safe. We don't really care. The world's different today. We can now do that. We have deep inspection. So we can look at what users are doing across web, across through CASB, through Secure Web Gateway, but we can also do it through ZTNA as well. We're also architected for any porting protocol. A lot of the other vendors out there using ZTNA technologies today can only do kind of 80 and 443, right? They cannot do more than that. They cannot do legacy protocols. They cannot do AS400. And I think one of the other things is pretty critical is this concept of server-initiated flows. So the benefits of legacy VPN, if I can say it's a benefit, is when a user connects over VPN, they can go everywhere on the network. They can access everything. They get full visibility of the network. And also everything on that LAN or WAN on that internal network can also see all of those clients. So things like being able to push patches, you can push patches over your VPN client. You can do remote control over your VPN client. You can do VoIP calls, for instance, from a server on-prem to your VPN client through the VPN client. With any of the other ZTNA vendors, you can't do that because it's only client to server. The servers do not know of the clients. We've got a way of virtualizing IP address, giving synthetic IP addresses so that we can, with zero trust in mind, we can resolve those VoIP problems. We can resolve those push patching problems. And this is one of the core problems I had with the first vendor that I used, which led me to find an access, was I had SCCM. I needed to push patches out. I didn't want people on the network unless they'd been patched. I didn't want them coming in over VPN. We also had a tool for our IT team that would allow you to remote control people and look at their machine for troubleshooting. That didn't work. That vendor at the time said to me, just publish those tools to the internet, which I really didn't want to do. Because for me, that's not the world we're living in. We need to do this differently. The other elements I've covered, I've talked about our multi-pop architecture. I've talked about the benefits of being built in the cloud. I've talked about the performance benefits it gives us and the user experience. I've talked about local edge a little bit. What IPsec ZTNA is, and this is really that the power of the wider kind of HPE portfolio is we're going to start to embed our connector technology into our SD-WAN boxes. First, it will be being able to run connectors on the SD-WAN boxes virtualized, and then it will be the technology in there. Then we're going to start to move our SD-WAN devices out to the cloud. So rather than get to the edge of the network and create an IPsec tunnel into our cloud, you'll be able to do SD-WAN all the way to the cloud. So that gives you all the SD-WAN benefits. You'll be able to connect all of the sites directly into our cloud so that then you can start to do that zero trust network access across those connections, okay? I think the key thing that we need to consider is what are the business benefits of SSE? We've talked about the technology. I've explained some of the technology differentiation, But why are people moving to SSE? What is the real reason, and what is the benefit to the business? And really that's around that kind of granular access. It's that zero trust access. Many people I speak to really want to go in the direction of zero trust. It's part of US regulations. It's part of mandates in the US. It's part of regulations across the globe. And it's really a direction people are going in. So really that's what this is that granular access, eliminating that attack surface, protecting your remote users. Then you've got the productivity element. I've mentioned specifically with things like VPN, you've got poor user experience. So that ZTNA element brings in that enhanced user experience. But also users are familiar with having to use multiple different tools. Removing that, making it more simple, simplification, makes it easier for the users. But also I think what's critical to remember is when you have a very complex environment, it's really hard to be secure. You have places and gaps between those technologies. When I mentioned the journey of that employee through all those on-prem services, those services are generally run by different people. They're from different hardware vendors, different software vendors. There's gaps between those technologies. And it's those gaps that people hide in that want to attack you. They can lurk around in your network in those gaps, and you can't see what's going on. So really, for me, this highlights that we can go more secure with SSE. You can offer better productivity to the business, and that simplification makes people's lives easier, right? I used to show this slide differently, and this is really the path that you can take to that unified SASE. However, there are multiple paths. This is just what we tend to see. We tend to see either people start with SD-WAN and go up from the right-hand side to the middle, or we primarily see people with that third-party and contractor risk, those BYOD devices, those people where you don't want to put an agent on the device. They start there, then they start to kind of talk about their enterprise users. Okay, we have a different VPN maybe for them, or we have multiple VPNs. Let's consolidate into having a single VPN. And then they start to consider, okay, we have a secure web gateway already in place. We have a CASB already in place. Why would we not consolidate that into the same user interface from the same vendor? Why would we not to start make our lives easier, simplify, less tools, make it easier for the users? And then people climb up from the left-hand side, okay? But really, I think the key thing to remember is any journey towards zero trust is just that, it's a journey. I'm good friends with John Kindervag, really who's seen as like the father of zero trust. And I remember asking him about 2 or 3 years ago, where should you start your zero trust journey? And his answer to me was, it's not where you start, it's that you must start. And to me, that was a real good answer to that question, because it's really, we don't want to be here in a year's time. Me and Justin don't want to be here in a year's time meeting with the same group of people, and some of you have been compromised because you haven't been able to start the journey, or you didn't know where to start the journey. So I think what's important to remember is to start the journey, and really to start where you see your most critical risks, wherever they may be, and they're different per business, okay? I am getting to the end of my deck. I'm glad I bet you're glad to hear. I've mentioned this a little bit, but this is really the power of HP Aruba networking, okay? So we've got good SD-WANs. We've got a number of SD-WAN offerings. We've got SD Branch, we've got Edge Connect, we've got Micro Branch. We've then got the SSE element of the access acquisition. You combine those together and you've already got this kind of concept of unified SASE. More and more, we're going to be consolidating those if you wish to. You can take our SD-WAN, you can take our SSE. We are going to continue to work with other vendors as well if you choose not to consolidate. But as I've mentioned, there's power in consolidation. And then if you widen that and you start to consider this idea of universal ZTNA that Gartner are talking about, zero trust from everywhere, we have things already for that. You can leave our agent running from our SSE portfolio and do kind of NAC on-prem, or we have ClearPass for IoT and OT as well. For me, coming from a manufacturing company, that IoT and that OT was a pretty critical risk for me. It was an area that I couldn't really manage and couldn't get a handle on. And we tried to segment it, but more and more they needed access to our domain or file servers. But when you start to consider everything we have in our arsenal, and Justin alluded to it at the beginning of the call, with the Juniper acquisition being announced and it hopefully closing soon, we've got even more tools in our arsenal. So really, you can start to see how with our access points, with our switches, with our data center networking, with our SSC, with our SD-WAN, bring all those elements together and start to unify them into a single platform, and then wrap AI around and get that really heuristic view and being able to be proactive. We can really start to consider zero trust from everywhere and with that single vendor concept. Okay. That's really it from me. That was a lot of words, and I'm sorry. But Justin, I don't know if there are any questions in the chat or whether you have anything you'd like to ask.
Yeah, I do have a few things, but yeah, it's a good time for if anyone has any questions as we're wrapping up on time and content. Feel free to reach out. But I do have a few things I kind of wanted to maybe retouch on a little bit, and it's really about the ROI you were speaking of. I've talked to a lot of organizations about like, when we talk about simplicity, sometimes engineers think about their own simplicity, not their end user simplicity. So what I mean by that is it's not that hard to take a traditional firewall and apply some ACLs to that VPN profile and say, Justin can only have access to X, Y, and Z, right? That's very possible. We're not saying that that's not possible. But the simplicity for the engineer is definitely there. But I think the simplicity is more on the end user side as well, because they, regardless of where that data is, how they're getting that data, they're going to see an ROI and simplicity from the end user. Single way to get in, regardless of where that data lives, or like you're talking before, they don't have to disconnect and reconnect on different tools, or disconnect to do a Teams call because video is clunky when they're on the session. So they see ROI. The business is going to see ROI for the end users because it's less work for them. They're going to see an ROI because it's better performance for them. And it's easier on the engineers because it's one pane of glass. That slide you had earlier with all those pluses on there, all of those things are a single product, right? It's not 18 products that you have to go log into and make additional changes to. You're making one platform change to modify it.
I think the
Another
key
thing,
thing is, as I mentioned, is that visibility element. So yes, you can put ACLs on your firewall and you can do those things, but can you see on your firewall everything that is happening in the cloud through CASB? Can you see everything that they're doing from a secure web gateway point of view? When they come on-prem, where do you look? Do you have to look in a different tool? Like those areas of being able to just see across your whole environment, no matter whether a user's on a corporate device or their own device, whether it's a Linux, whether it's a Mac, whether it's Android or iOS phone, whatever it might be, Windows machine, whether they're in a coffee shop or at home or they're on the LAN or the WAN, being able to see that in a single pane of glass is not only pretty essential for troubleshooting, but can really help you be proactive in protection. Because if you have been compromised, and zero trust really assumes breach, what tool do you go in to find the answer? You start over here in one tool, and then you get to the end of the path, and then you kind of have to go to another tool, and you have to find the start of the path again. And I don't know if you ever read books when you were a child, but I used to read books when I was a child that said, depending on what you want to do, go to page 7 or page 50 or whatever. You can take a different path, right? This reminds me of doing that versus just reading a book that's easy to follow, right? So
yeah, absolutely. So with that, we'll wrap up here. As far as takeaways here for organizations that are listening to this right now, like the key takeaway here is hopefully you learned a few things, but there are some ways that we can get started very, very small. Like we're the one slide that had kind of the journey. Do you want to start on the left or the right? You're going to start kind of more sassy or whatnot. We can take one use case and solve that use case for you now. And a lot of times the easy stuff is what Access was originally born for, which is vendor management, right? Rather than having the vendors log into your VPN, create unique scenarios so those vendors can get in or ship them a laptop or pump them through a VDI session and make their latency painful. We can do an agentless deployment with two-factor, all the bells and whistles from security, and get them into the tools that they need to perform their job function very, very quickly. That's an easy POC we can do, or we can do the full gamut and integrate into your cloud and all your data center stuff. But it really starts out with a design session. What are the use cases you have? What are the tools you have? What problems are we trying to solve for the business? and how can he accelerate the business for you.
That was a good synopsis. Thank you.
So with that, we'll shut it down, and I appreciate everyone joining today, and have a great afternoon.